Hey everybody, today we are going to draw something in a sketchbook, and right now I'm using this kind of table easel thingy to make the sketching process a little bit more ergonomic. I still don't know what to think about this thing, if it makes it better. It's better for my neck but not better for my wrist. I only used it for the sketch here because it is kind of hard to film like this, honestly. But you can see that I'm sketching out this little frog on a little island, and then we can also see underneath on the water, you can see that there's greenery in the water, and later on I'm gonna add some fish in there as well. At first I'm going to use Caran markers because this video is actually sponsored by them, and I love doing things like this with the Caran markers because they're really fun to use on watercolor paper because you can blend them just with each other or also with a wet brush. You can blend them with water. These are the Caran brush markers, not to be confused with their more acrylic markers that are the deco brush markers, because I've been getting questions about them. There's these two different types. I personally prefer the brush markers because these, like I said, can be blended with water, and I really like the effects that they make. They kind of remind me, they're like a mixture of watercolors and alcohol markers in a way, because usually when you have water-based markers, then they will look really streaky, but with these, if you use them on watercolor paper and you are a little bit careful with blending them out, and also depending on the color and the paper, of course, you can get pretty even results. They don't look as streaky as regular water-based markers would, and this is why they're so fun to use, because you can get a lot of different effects. So I've been using them for a long time, and you can see that I have started to color all of the things in on my picture, and I started with this very light yellow tone. I believe it's called almond. It's one of my absolute favorite colors because it is such a good base color, and I am just starting to build all of the colors here. I was going back and forth on the different spots of the piece because when the markers are still wet, I let them dry unless I want them to blend. And here you can see that I was drawing a bit of them on this plastic palette, and then I dipped my brush into it and colored the background of the sky, and this created the most even background I believe that I've ever managed to create. And I think I'm gonna do this when I use watercolors or something in the future as well. Just get out a Caran marker and then mix it with a little bit of water, because this looks so even. I have tried to do this in the past with watercolors and it's so much harder, but with this ink, I don't know, I was really pleasantly surprised at how well this worked. And here I'm using the Hahnemühle 100% cotton watercolor sketchbook. I really like the paper for things like this because it just creates the most even look, and it is really easy to use, honestly. And you can see that I'm also kind of starting to blend the stuff with the wet brush. And like I said, I'm going back and forth on this entire piece, hopping from one section to the next, because then I let one section dry a bit and then I go around it, because these markers, they blend very easily. That can be a pro and sometimes also a con. It really depends on what you're going for. But if you're using them on watercolor paper, they might blend, depending on the paper, they might blend really, really well. And sometimes when you want them to look really crisp, I would recommend then going back in later with some other art supply that can give you the sharpness that you might want, if that's what you do want. I am going to use some colored pencils for this piece later on to just add a few details and also get a little bit of a grainy look and the texture that you can get with colored pencils. But for now, I'm just coloring everything in and getting a little bit of a base. And if you're wondering why certain sections blend into each other a little bit, I'm really not worried about that because, like I said, later on, I'm gonna get all of the sharpness back. But these markers, I've realized, are a really good base for stuff like that. So I have tried to do a little bit more mixed media in the past. My last video where I did mixed media was really popular, which was kind of surprising, honestly. I mean, I thought that the thumbnail would do well because it is this kind of style that people seem to enjoy, but I was not sure if people were okay with me calling it a colored pencils ideas video and then also using watercolors. And I did get only positive comments on that video, so thank you to everybody who watched it. Thank you to everybody who left a nice comment. I'm still reading through all of those comments, and if you are a new subscriber who came from that video, maybe welcome. I hope you like it here. And I'm trying to do a little bit more mixed media because it is just so much fun to combine different types of mediums together and get the best of all of them, because every single type of art supply is better at something than another one might be. So for me, honestly, it is really hard to pick just one, and that's why I'm always trying to use all of the supplies that I use to their best abilities and use them in a way that just makes sense, honestly, because I don't want to force an art supply into something that it isn't, because that makes no sense. So here I am using the Caran markers on watercolor paper, which I normally do because these are very juicy. Even after using them for a long time, they're still very, very juicy. They just don't seem to dry out much. And that's why they do really well on watercolor paper, because it almost feels like watercolor, but I think it is a little bit easier in a way because you don't have to pre-mix your colors. You're just gonna use the colors that you have and can create a limited palette, and you can also get more of the precision and easiness that comes from using a marker versus using watercolors. I also find that when I use watercolors or gouache, I tend to go into detail a lot and get lost in the details because I can always just get a smaller brush. And I know that's just something that I personally do, but with markers, I always kind of feel a little bit taken back to when I was a kid and was just drawing something with markers and was a little bit more carefree and not so focused on every single tiny detail. So it really makes a good medium for a first layer like here, where I'm just getting a feel for all of the colors, where I'm gonna put what. And honestly, with this piece in the state that it is right now, this is kind of how I wished I would have let the colors be, because I went slightly darker afterwards, and I think I went a little bit overboard, but that's just my personal opinion. I don't know why, but I really liked the colors here. They were bright and fun, and I still like the colors in the finished piece, but I wish I hadn't added just as many details as I did. So if you decide to recreate this or get inspired by it, just feel free to do it in whatever way you want to. You can see here I'm introducing a much darker color, and in hindsight, I believe this is where it started to go a little bit overboard a little bit with the contrast and with the depth. I don't know, I wanted a lot of contrast, but then I didn't really know where to put it because this is a very dark green marker, and then I tried to tie it into the whole landscape. I think it worked out well in the end, but honestly, if I do something like this again, I might just stick to a little bit of a lighter palette because it was really enjoyable. But honestly, if you recreate it, do it in whatever way you want. I might, if I use a similar color palette again, I might use this exact same green marker because it has a really nice green tint, but just draw on a piece of plastic again, like I did earlier with the turquoise bluish color, and just dilute it a little bit with water because that way you can get a lighter tint of every single color that you have. And yeah, that might have been the way, I don't know. But in this moment, I was kind of not, I did not know where this would end up because I thought that the darker color was spread all over the place, and I didn't really have a concept for it, I have to admit. But I did try to incorporate it a little bit more into the sketch, and later on also I used colored pencils and I added in a lot of details with a dark colored pencil, so it looked a lot more cohesive. I don't know if those ramblings make sense to you. I never know really what to say in these types of videos because you can already see what I'm doing on the screen, and I find it rather boring to just narrate every single step that I'm taking and tell you, here I'm using a green tone and I'm drawing some bushes, because you can already see that. And by the way, I have the bigger set from Caran markers, so I like to just select a limited color palette for myself and then just use those colors that I picked, and maybe go in and add a color here and there if I find that a certain color would fit the piece. But I find that if you have more colors to choose from, it is a good idea to then go ahead and limit your palette, because if I were to use every single color that I own, this would look so overbearing. It would be way too much unless I would maybe try to do a rainbow gradient, which I've also done in the past when I wanted to use a lot of colors. I just try to somewhat have it in a way that is pleasing to the eye and not go too much overboard. Here you can see that I started with the colored pencils. I wanted to use my Prismacolor colored pencils again, but quite honestly, if you want to add sharp details, these are not the best choice. I would use harder colored pencils like polychromos, or maybe even the Staedtler colored pencils, which are much harder and sharper, but then you also have to press much harder to get the color on the page. I was using these colored pencils for the details and some kind of line art in a way, but also I added a little bit of the texture that I already mentioned earlier, because I wanted this to look illustrative and fun and playful. So I like playing around with the different textures, and I have these areas that look super smooth, and then we have the areas that look a little bit more grainy, and it is purposeful. I don't like it when the entire piece is just done with colored pencils. I found that that's not really my thing unless you're using smoother paper or you press down really hard and burnish or blend your colored pencils in a way. I mean, you can get them to look really smooth and not have any texture. Of course, people do that all the time, especially people who know a lot about color pencils. They use different solvents and stuff to blend them, and there's so much possibility there. But personally, I like doing something like this where you have certain areas that are super smooth, like the background in the sky, for example, and then you have certain areas that have a little bit of that texture from the colored pencil. Also the water is super smooth, and then we have those lines that have a little bit of that texture, and I was trying to play around with that and getting a good balance of the two. If I were to do it again, I might use a little bit less of the colored pencils, add a little bit less texture and detail, because I think it's almost too much on this piece. I really haven't made up my mind yet whether I love it or I don't. I also added a little bit of a pink touch here with this pink purple color, and I just tried to brighten it all up because I at first used some brown on these more orange parts in the water, and it looked a little bit too brown to me, so I wanted to brighten it all up a little bit, and so I just colored over that and also over the trees, so we have that color repeating there. I always like to spread the colors around on the piece so it kind of is more cohesive and everything goes together. I don't like it when a color is just in one spot of a piece unless it's really intentional. And I also tried to add a lot of doodles to the trees and the bushes. And I also added a little bit of that pink to the frog because I wanted the frog to stand out a little bit more. And I wanted the frog to have a bit of the texture too. So this is what the piece ended up looking like. I really hope that you enjoyed this. And if you want to see another video where I used Caran markers, then check out this one next.